Chapter 3. The Tragedy of Birlstone. And now for a moment I will ask you to remove my own insignificant personality and to describe the events which occurred before we arrived on the scene by the light of knowledge which came to us afterwards. Only in this way can I make the reader appreciate the people concerned by the strange setting in which their fate was cast. The village of Birlstone is a small and very ancient cluster of half-timbered cottages on the northern border of the county of Sussex. For centuries it had remained unchanged, but within the last few years its picturesque appearance and situation have attracted a number of well-to-do residents, whose villas peep out from the woods around. These woods are locally supposed to be the extreme fringe of the Great Weald Forest, which thins away until it reaches the northern chalk downs. A number of small shops have come into being which meets the wants of the increased population, so that there seems some prospect that Birlstone may very soon grow from an ancient village into a modern town. It is the centre for a considerable area of county. Since Tunbridge Wells, the nearest place of importance, is 10 or 12 miles to the east over the borders of Kent. About half a mile from the town, standing in an old park famous for its huge beech trees, is the ancient manor house of Birlstone. Part of this venerable building dates back to the time of the First Crusade, when Hugo de Campus built a fortalice in the center of the estate, which has been granted to him by the Red King. This was destroyed by a fire in 1543, and some of its smoke-blackened cornerstones were used then, in Jacobean times. A brick country house rose upon the ruins of the feudal castle. The manor house, with its many gables and its small, diamond-patterned windows, was still much as the builder had left it in the early 17th century. Of the double moats which had guarded its more warlike predecessor, the outer has been allowed to dry up, and serve the humble function of a kitchen garden. The inner one, which is still there, lay 40 feet in breadth, though now only a few feet in depth, around the whole house. A small stream fed it and continued beyond it, so that a sheet of water, though turbid, was never ditch-like or unhealthy. The ground floor windows were within a foot of the surface of the water. The only approach to the house was over a drawbridge, the chains and windlass of which had long been rusted and broken. The latest tenants of the manor house had, however, with characteristic energy, set this right, and the drawbridge was not only capable of being raised, but actually was raised every evening and lowered every morning. By thus renewing the custom of the old feudal days, the manor house was converted into an island during the night. A fact which had very direct bearing upon the mystery which was soon to engage the attention of all of England. The house had been untenanted for some years, and was threatening to moulder into a picturesque decay when the Douglases took possession of it. This family consisted of only 2 individuals, John Douglas and his wife. Douglas was a remarkable man both in character and in person. In age he may have been about 50, with a strong-jawed and rugged face, a grizzled moustache, particularly keen green eyes, and a wiry, vigorous figure which lost nothing of the strength and activity of youth. He was cheery and genial to all, but somewhat offhand in his manners, giving the impression that he had seen life in social strata on some far lower horizon than the county society of Sussex. Though looked at with some curiosity and reserve by his more cultivated neighbours, he soon acquired a great popularity among the villagers, subscribing handsomely to all the local objects, and attending their smoking concerts and other functions, where, having a remarkably rich tenor voice, he was always ready to oblige with an excellent song. He appeared to have plenty of money, which was said to have been granted in the Californian goldfields, and it was clear from his own talk and that of his wife that he had spent a great part of his life in America. The good impression which had been produced by his generosity and by his democratic manners was increased by a reputation gained for his utter indifference to danger. Though a wretched rider, he turned out at every meet, and he took the most amazing falls in his determination to hold his own with the best. When the vicarage caught fire, he distinguished himself by the fearlessness with which he re-entered the building to save property, after the local fire brigade had given it up as impossible. Thus it became that John Douglas of the Manor House had within 5 years won himself quite a reputation in Birlstone. His wife, too, was popular with those who had made her acquaintance, though after the English fashion, the colours upon a stranger who settled in the county without introductions were few and far between. This mattered the less to her, as she was retiring in disposition, and very much absorbed, to all appearance, in her husband and her domestic duties. It was known that she was an English lady who had met Mr. Douglas in London, he being at the time a widower. She was a beautiful woman, tall and dark and slender, some 20 years younger than her husband, a disparity which seemed in no wise to mar the contentment of their family life. It was remarked sometimes, however, by those who knew them best that the confidence between the two did not appear to be complete, since the wife was either very reluctant about her husband's past or life, as seemed more likely, was very imperfectly informed about it. It had also been noted that, and commented upon by the few observant people, that there were signs sometimes of some nerve strain upon the part of Miss Douglas, and that she would display acute uneasiness if her absent husband should ever be particularly late in his return. On a quiet countryside, where all gossip is welcome, the weakness of the lady of the manor house did not pass without remark, and it bulked larger upon people's memories when the events arose which gave it a very special significance. There was yet another individual whose residence under the roof was, it is true, only an intermittent one, but whose presence at the time the strange happenings will now be narrated brought his name prominently before the public. This was Cecil James Barker, of Hale's Lounge, Hampstead. Cecil Barker's tall, loose-jointed figure was a familiar one in the main street of Birlstone village, for he was a frequent and welcome visitor at the manor house. He was more noticed as being the only friend from the past life of Mr. Douglas who was ever seen in his new English surroundings. Barker was himself undoubtedly Englishman, but his remarks it was clear that he had first known Douglas in America, and he had lived there to imitate terms with him. He appeared to be a man of considerable wealth, and reputed as to be a bachelor. In age he was rather younger than Douglas, 45 at the most, a tall, straight, broad-chested fellow with a clean-shaven, prize-fighter face, thick, strong black eyebrows, and a pair of masterful black eyes, which might, even without the aid of his very capable hands, clear a way for him through a hostile crowd. He neither rode nor shot, but spent his days in wandering around the old village with his pipe in his mouth, or in driving with his host, or in his absence with his hostess, over the beautiful countryside. An easy-going, free-handed gentleman, said Ames the butler, but my word, I'd rather not be the man that crossed him. He was cordial and intimate with Douglas, and he was no less friendly with his wife, a friendship which was more than once seemed to cause irritation to the husband, so that even the servants were able to perceive his annoyance. Such was the third person who was in the family when the catastrophe occurred. As to the other denizens of the old building, it will suffice out of a large household to mention the prim, respectable, and capable Ames and Mr. Allen, a buxom and cheerful person who relieved the lady of some of her household cares. Some 16 servants in the house bear no relation to the events of the night of January 6th. It was at 11:45 that the first alarm reached the small local police station in the charge of Sergeant Wilson of the Sussex Constabulary. Mr. Cecil Barker, much excited, he rushed up to the door and pealed furiously upon the bell. A terrible tragedy had occurred at the manor house, and Mr. John Douglas had been murdered. That was the breathless burden of his message. When he had hurried back to the house, he followed within a few minutes with the police sergeant, who arrived at the scene of the crime a little past 12 o'clock, after taking prompt steps to warn the county authorities that something serious was afoot. On reaching the manor house, the sergeant had found the drawbridge down, the windows lighted up, and the whole household was in a state of wild confusion and alarm. The white-faced servants were huddled together in the hall, with the frightened butler wringing his hands in the doorway. Only Cecil Barker seemed to be the master of himself and his emotions. He had opened the door which was nearest to the entrance, and had beckoned to the sergeant to follow him. At the moment there arrived Dr. Wood, a brisk and capable general practitioner from the village. 3 men entered the fatal room together, while the horror-stricken butler followed at their heels, closing the door behind him to shut out the terrible scene from the maidservants. The dead man lay upon his back, sprawling in outstretched limbs in the center of the room. He was clad only in a pink dressing gown which covered his night clothes. There were carpet slippers upon his bare feet. The doctor knelt beside him and held down the hand lamp which stood at the table. One glance at the victim was enough to know that show the healer that his presence could not be dispensed with. The man had been horribly injured. Lying across his chest was a curious weapon, a shotgun with the barrel sawn off a foot in front of the triggers. It was clear that this had been fired at close range, and that he had received the whole cartridge in the face, blowing his head almost to pieces. The triggers had been wired together as to make sure the simultaneous discharge more destructive. The country policeman was unnerved and troubled by the tremendous responsibility which had come so suddenly upon him. "We'll touch nothing until my superiors arrive," said he in a hushed voice, staring in horror at the dreadful head. "Nothing has been touched up to now," said Cecil Barker. "I'll answer for that. You see it all exactly as I found it." When was that? The sergeant had drawn out his notebook. It was 11:30. I had not begun to undress, and I was sitting by the fire in my bedroom when I heard the report. It was not very loud. It seemed to be muffled. I rushed down, and I don't suppose it was 30 seconds before I was in the room. Was the door open? Yes, it was open. Poor Douglas was lying as you see him. His bedroom candle was burning on the table. It was I who lit the lamp some minutes afterwards. Did you see no one? No, I heard Mrs. Douglas coming down the stair behind me, and I rushed to prevent her from seeing the dreadful sight. Mrs. Allen, the housekeeper, came and took her away. Ames had arrived, and we ran back into the room once more. But surely I've heard that the drawbridge is kept up at night. Yes, it was up until I lowered it. Then how could any murderer have got away? It is out of the question. Mr. Douglas must have shot himself. And that was our first idea, but see, Barker drew behind the curtains and showed the long diamond-pane window was open to its full extent. And look at this. He held the lamp down and illuminated a smudge of blood like the mark of a boot sole upon the wooden sill. Someone has stood here and getting out. You mean to say that someone waded across the moat? Exactly. Then if you were in the room within half a minute of the crime, he must have been in the water at the very moment. I have no doubt of it. I wish to heaven that I had rushed to the window. But the curtain screened it, and as you see, so it never occurred to me. Then I heard the step of Mrs. Douglas, and I could not let her into the room. It would have been too horrible. Horrible enough, said the doctor, looking at the shattered head and the terrible marks which surrounded it. I've never seen such injuries since Birlstone railway smash. What I say, remarked the police sergeant, whose slow, common sense was still pondering over the open window. It's all very well you're saying that a man escaped by wading his moat, but what I ask you is, how did he ever get into the house at all if the bridge was up? That's the question, said Barker. At what o'clock was it raised? It was nearly 6 o'clock, said Imes the butler. I've heard, said the sergeant, that it was usually raised at sunset. That would be near half past 4 than 6 at this time of the year. Mrs. Douglas had visitors to tea, said Ames. I couldn't raise it until they went. Then I wound it up myself. Then it comes to this, said the sergeant. If anyone came from outside, if they did, they must have got in across the bridge before 6 and have been hiding ever since. Till Mr. Douglas came into the room after 11. That is so. Mr. Douglas went around the house every night, and the last thing before he turned in was to see that the lights were right. That brought him in here. The man was waiting and shot him. Then he got away through the window and left his gun behind. That's how I read it. For nothing else will fit the facts. The sergeant picked up a card which lay beside the dead man upon the floor. The initial was VV, and under it the number 341, were rudely scrawled in ink upon it. What's this? He asked, holding it up. Barker looked at it with curiosity. I never noticed it before, he said. The murderer must have left it behind him. VV341. I can make no sense of that. The sergeant kept turning it over in his big fingers. What's VV? Someone's initials, maybe? What have you got there, Miss Dr. Wood? It was a good-sized hammer which had been lying upon the rug in front of the fireplace. A substantial workmanlike hammer. Cecil Barker pointed to a box of brass-headed nails upon the mantelpiece. Mr. Douglas was altering the pictures yesterday, he said. I saw him myself standing upon that chair and fixing a big picture above it. That accounts for the hammer. We'd best put it back on the rug where we found it, said the sergeant, scratching his puzzled head in perplexity. It will want the rest of brains and the force to get to the bottom of this thing. It will be a London job before it's finished. He raised his hand lamp and walked slowly around the room. Holla, he cried excitedly, drawing a window curtain to the side. What o'clock were these windows drawn? When the lamps were lit, said the butler. It would be shortly after 4. Someone has been hiding here, sure enough. He knelt down with the lights. The marks of muddy boots were visible in the corner. I'm bound to say these bear out to your theory, Mr. Barker. It looks as if the man got into the house after 4, when the curtains were drawn, but before 6, when the bridge was raised. He slipped into the room because it was the first that he saw. There's no other place where he could hide, so he popped in behind the curtain. That seems all clear enough. It's likely that the man's idea was to burgle the house. But Mr. Douglas chanced upon him and murdered him, and escaped. That's how I read it, said Barker. But I say, aren't we wasting precious time? Couldn't we start out and scour the country before the fellow gets away? The sergeant considered for a moment. There are no trains before 6 in the morning, and he can't get away by rail. If he goes by road with his legs all dripping, it's odds that someone will notice him. Anyhow, we can't leave here myself until I am relieved. But I think none of you should go until we see more clearly how we all stand. The doctor had taken the hand lamp and was narrowly scrutinizing the body. What's this mark? He asked. Does this have any connection to the crime? The dead man's right arm was thrust out of his dressing gown and exposed as high as his elbow. About halfway up the forearm was a curious brown design. A triangle inside a circle, standing out in vivid relief upon the lard-colored skin. It's not tattooed, said the doctor, peering through his glasses. Never saw anything like it. The man has been branded, and for some time likes to brand cattle. What's the meaning of this? I don't profess to know the meaning of it, said Cecil Barker, but I've seen the mark in Douglas many times the past 10 years. So have I, said the butler. Many a time when the master has rolled up his sleeves, I have noticed the mark. I've often wondered what it could be. Then it has nothing to do with the crime anyhow, said the sergeant. But it's a rum thing all the same. Everything about this case is rum. Well, what is it now? The butler had given an exclamation of astonishment, and was pointing at the dead man's outstretched hand. They've taken his wedding ring, he gasped. What? Yes, indeed, the master always wore his plain gold wedding ring on his little finger of his left hand. The ring with the rough nuggets on it was above it, and the twisted snake ring on the third finger. There's the nuggets, and there's the snake, but the wedding ring is gone. He's right, said Barker. Do you tell me, said the sergeant, that the wedding ring was below the other? Always. Then the murderer, whoever he was, took the ring off first, took the ring you call the nugget ring, then the wedding ring, and afterwards put the wedding nugget ring back on. That is so. The worthy country policeman shook his head. It seems to me the sooner we get London on this case, the better, said. White Mason is a smart man. No local job has been too much for White Mason. It won't be long now before he is here to help us, but I expect we'll have to look to London before we're through. Anyhow, I'm not ashamed to say that it was a deal too thick for the likes of me.